If you hear the whistle at night, don't follow it. My night in a lost town. I thought the town was abandoned, but then I heard the faint sound of a whistle in the dark, and I knew I wasn't alone. It started as a weekend trip with my best friend Darren. We'd planned to do some hiking, camping, and a bit of urban exploration. Both of us were into old, abandoned places and loved taking photos of eerie spots most people wouldn't go near. Darren had heard about an old mining town in the mountains totally abandoned since the early 1900s. Supposedly, the town had been left untouched after a series of accidents at the mines, and over the years, locals started telling stories of ghost sightings and strange noises in the area. It was remote, quiet, and hidden away, exactly the kind of place we liked. We packed up and left early on a Friday morning, planning to reach the town by afternoon. The trail was difficult, winding through dense woods and rocky hills, but we were determined to see this place for ourselves. After a few hours of hiking, we finally saw it through the trees, a collection of old wooden buildings, some barely standing, overgrown with weeds and vines. As we approached, a strange feeling crept over me. The place felt heavy, like it was holding its breath, but Darren just grinned, snapping photos and pointing out old buildings as we walked through the center of town. The buildings were exactly what you'd expect for an abandoned mining town, mostly wooden shacks, a small general store, a decrepit schoolhouse, and a few larger buildings that looked like old company offices. The mines themselves were up a small hill at the edge of town, looming over us like they were watching. We spent the afternoon exploring, taking pictures and trying to imagine what life was like in this forgotten place. As the sun began to set, Darren suggested we camp out in one of the larger buildings, an old hotel that had mostly withstood the test of time. I was hesitant, but he was so excited that I agreed, figuring it would make for a good story later. The hotel was musty and filled with cobwebs, but structurally, it was surprisingly intact. We set up our sleeping bags in the lobby, which still had an old front desk, a dusty chandelier, and even a few pieces of broken furniture. It was actually kind of cool, in a creepy way. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped, and an eerie silence settled over the town. We chatted for a while, swapping ghost stories and laughing at how ridiculous they sounded when you were actually out in a place like this. Then, just as we were settling down, I heard it, a faint, distant sound. High-pitched, shrill, and unmistakable, a whistle. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked at Darren. He had heard it too. We both stared at each other, listening. The whistle came again, a little closer this time. It was a simple tune, the kind you'd hear someone whistle absent-mindedly, a few rising notes, then a fall, repeated over and over. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. Darren shrugged, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "Probably just the wind or an animal," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. But it didn't sound like the wind, and I'd never heard an animal make a sound like that. It was too deliberate. We decided to ignore it, figuring it was just one of those weird noises that come out at night. But as we lay there in silence, the whistle kept coming. Sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always the same tune. After about an hour, I couldn't take it anymore. I sat up and looked at Darren. "I need to check this out," I said. "I won't be able to sleep until I know what it is." Darren looked at me like I was crazy, but eventually, he nodded, grabbing his flashlight and following me outside. Outside, the town was pitch black. The only light came from our flashlights, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. The whistle had stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. We walked slowly down the main road, sweeping our lights over the buildings and trying to pinpoint where the sound had come from. Just as we reached the edge of town, the whistle started up again, this time louder and definitely closer. It was coming from the direction of the mines. My stomach churned. I didn't want to go up there, but curiosity and adrenaline pushed me forward. Darren followed, though I could tell he was just as scared as I was. Together, we climbed the small hill to the mines, the sound growing louder with each step. At the top, we found ourselves facing the main entrance to the mine, a massive, dark tunnel framed by rotting wooden beams. The whistle was coming from inside. Darren looked at me, and I could tell he was thinking the same thing I was. We should turn back. But the sound was so close now, almost taunting us, that I couldn't stop myself. I took a step forward, shining my flashlight into the darkness. Nothing. The whistle stopped. I turned to Darren, about to suggest we head back, when I saw the expression on his face. His eyes were wide, his face pale. He was staring at something behind me. Slowly, I turned around, my flashlight trembling in my hand. At first, I saw nothing, just the yawning black mouth of the mine, but then, just at the edge of the light, something moved. It was a shadow, tall and thin, almost blending into the darkness, except for the faint glimmer of eyes that were watching us. I froze, unable to look away. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there staring. Then, without warning, it started to whistle. I felt a chill so deep it felt like it reached my bones. I took a step back, and the shadow moved forward, mirroring me, its whistling growing louder and more erratic. Darren grabbed my arm. "Let's go," he whispered, his voice shaking. We turned and bolted back down the hill, not daring to look back. The whistle followed us, echoing through the night, growing fainter only as we reached the town. But even then, it didn't disappear completely. Back in the hotel, we barricaded the door with whatever we could find. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my flashlight. Darren looked just as rattled, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. We sat there in silence, listening. For a while, there was nothing, just the sound of our own breathing and the occasional creak of the old building. I started to think maybe we were safe, that whatever was up at the mine had stayed there. But then, just as I was starting to relax, the whistle came again. This time, it was right outside the hotel. I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The sound drilled into my head, filling me with an overwhelming sense of dread. Darren was rocking back and forth, his eyes squeezed shut, whispering, "This isn't real. This isn't real," over and over. The whistle grew louder, more insistent, until I thought I was going to lose my mind. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. I looked at Darren, and he looked back at me. We both waited, barely daring to breathe. Finally, I whispered, "Do you think it's gone?" He nodded, though he didn't look convinced. "We just have to wait until morning," he said, his voice shaking. "As soon as it's light, we're getting out of here." We didn't sleep at all. Every so often, we'd hear the faint sound of the whistle in the distance, but it never got close again. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through the broken windows, we were already packed and ready to go. We left the hotel and walked through the silent town, our footsteps echoing on the cracked pavement. The place looked different in the daylight, less sinister, almost peaceful. But the memory of the whistle still haunted me, and I knew I would never forget it. As we reached the edge of town, I glanced back one last time, and there, standing on the hill by the mine, I saw it, a dark figure, watching us. He didn't whistle. It didn't move. It just stood there, a silent reminder of the night we just survived. We didn't stop walking until we reached our car. It's been weeks since that night, and I still hear the whistle sometimes. Late at night, when the house is quiet, I'll catch a faint, familiar tune drifting through the air. I've tried to convince myself it's my imagination, that it's just leftover fear from our time in that town. But I can't shake the feeling that something followed us back. That one day, I'll hear the whistle again, louder than before. And this time, it won't stop. If you ever find yourself in an old, forgotten town, and you hear whistling in the dark, don't follow it.